All right, let's get started. Got a lot of slides to go through. So I don't think I've ever tried to do this one in 30 minutes, so this will be a treat. So anyone saw my Ignite yesterday? So you guys already know who I am. Done lots of stuff. I'm an engineer by trade. I love engineering, and I really love security. Been doing it for, thinking about it yesterday, been doing it for half my career. So we're going to talk about application security. We're going to talk about why it's important, what that has to do with open source, and then again, what we can do about it. We covered this yesterday. This is the weak point in our infrastructure, our applications. They are meant and created to take sensitive data in and out of our enterprises. So we've got all the sensitive stuff. We get access to it through the application, and then we can transport that back and forth. So if our applications are weak, we are the cause of the breach. Hit this yesterday as well. So now let's talk about open source and how it's used. So can anyone here give me a bill of materials for any of the applications that they ship right now? Nobody. Okay, so that's expected. I'm not surprised. We don't build, when I started my career 25 plus years ago, you built everything. There was nothing there were no pieces. You had the compiler, you had some basic libraries like math libraries and such, and you built your application. Nowadays, most of your application is third-party components. 80 to 95% of the code you ship today, if you are writing microservice-based applications, for instance, 80 to 95% of that is open source from various places. Now this could be, actually it could be third-party as well, but your proprietary code, 5 to 15%. That's what you write, you glue it together. This is the analogy I use with other audiences that are less technical is you go to Home Depot and I give you all a shopping list. Same stuff. You got lumber, you got boarding, you got all windows and doors. I give you all the same things. All of your houses are gonna look different. You drive down the street, they're all built out of the same components, and yet they are all different. So this is what we do with open source. We take it together, we put our little magic dust on it, and we create unique applications from it. We are at a hockey stick right now of usage. Open source, of Docker and containers, which is yet another way to consume open source. An explosion of new components. 1,000 a day, 10,000 new versions of components within those repositories per day. It's staggering how fast we are creating these components. Just pulls from Docker Hub. I mean, take a look at that curve, and it just keeps going up. This is something that we're changing the way we deploy applications. So I loved the keynote this morning talking about enabling teams. This is part of what we're doing anyways, and we need some guidance and help from IT and from operations. We're taking containers, which are essentially operating systems, picking what we're going to do, and we're going to deploy it into the cloud. Are we doing it well or not? I don't know. Are we doing it securely? Probably not. Right, so what's the problem? And now I'm not going to tell you that open source is less secure, because it's not. It's written, guess what, by the same people that write software. Now, see, this is something that's puzzled me my entire career. The thought of working hard during the day and then going home and working hard again, yet for no money. Now, some people have a passion for it. God love you. It's not my gig, but it's written by the same people. So if we start with the premise that none of us were trained to write secure open source, to write secure code, then how do we think that open source is going to be more or less secure? It's just not. Now the problem is, remember I said 5 to 15% is first-party code? That's the stuff that we deal with every day. That's the stuff that we scan. That's the stuff that we write unit tests against. We have a lot of inspection in that code. When we integrate an open source or a third-party component, we abandon it. I know, I've done it. I picked JBoss and I said, hey, that works, it's perfect. Done. Now I'm going to go on and I've got to write features and I've got to add stuff to the product. The problem is that library continues its life without us. It goes through new versions. If there is a vulnerability that's detected, they're going to patch forward. They're not going to go back to all of the versions and patch them. So if there's a wide gap between where we selected our component And where they are now, we have to traverse that entire runway to go find that secure version. Now, there's also two ways of thinking about these components. So let's look at a couple of stats. So 96% of applications use open source. Average number of components. Now, this is the troubling one here. Vulnerabilities identified have been publicly known for 4 years. So Equifax, this is what happened to them. They didn't know it. They didn't patch it. They got breached. There was a non-vulnerable version available to them to upgrade. Okay, so let's look at the two ways that developers abandon components. The first one is explicitly. If I asked, who's a developer in the room here? So if I asked you guys, do you use struts in your application? You would know with certainty, yes or no, right? It's a top-level library. I know I'm using it because it's what I deal with and integrate with on an everyday basis. Now here is struts. Here are the vulnerable versions. You can see the non-vulnerable versions. They don't move. After these vulnerabilities are announced, we watch these stats. So I work for Veracode. We do application security. We scan these applications and see what their contents are. And we can tell whether people are actually doing and taking action on these vulnerabilities. And they're clearly not. So that's number one. Number two is implicitly. Now, if I go to those same people and say, do you use Apache Commons collections 3.2.1? I don't know. It's something that's brought into the application with things like struts and JBoss. So it's buried down deep inside. Now here is the most vulnerable version of Apache Commons collection. There were breaches associated with this. And yet, look at the utilization. People haven't moved off it. This is where I picked it up, and I'm done. Now, if we look at the problem associated with that, so here's this version of the library. And like I said, it's incorporated and included into other libraries as it goes downstream within 5 generations. This is a scary stat. Over 80,000 components. It's incorporated into 80,000 components, that specific version. How do you get a handle on that? So if you see, so in security, a CVE is a common vulnerability enumeration. It's something that's published in the National Vulnerability Database that everyone has access to. And I mean everyone, that means attackers and defenders. So when we talk, and we've seen this at the conference over the last 2 days, people talking about information leakage, showing them what you're using under the covers. Am I using IIS? Am I using Tomcat? Which version? You're giving attackers information that could just go to this vulnerability database and say, oh, what are they susceptible to? Let's try that. Think about the number of applications that those 80,000 components have been brought into. It's in the millions. Now, the software that we see, more than 26% of them had this specific version in it. Okay, so let's take a look at the Java components with high severity vulnerabilities. And of course, we see Common Collections 3.2.1. Now, a lot of these, well, here's one we'd recognize, right? I recognize Spring, recognize Struts, Spring Core. And a lot of these are just things that just come along. They come along for the ride inside of our software, inside of those top-level libraries that we use. Now, if we take a quick diversion here, does anyone have to give a list of the libraries that they use to their legal team for license compliance? Okay. So this is a place where we can actually make two things work, because I had to do that for legal and I had to do that for security. So if you're already doing it for one, this is a good place to start tracking this for the other. If you're not familiar with this, there are really 3 kinds of open source licensing, okay? And depending on which one you use, it has big ramifications for the source code that you ship and use. Basically, it's give me credit that you used it, give me the fixes that you make to it, or give me everything. This is the bad one. If you use this and you ship your product, you have to disclose all your source code. Now, this has happened to some companies that they don't pay attention to this specific risk, and someone finds it, and they say, you've got to disclose all your source code, or you have to publish it as open source now. What's that going to do to the IP of your company and its valuation? So be very careful about that. All right, so let's talk about strategy. Now this is application security in general, but open source specifically, we'll start with accountability. Right? So I talked yesterday about relationships. Those are critical. I need to have these relationships. Boy, I love it. I hate how old this deck is. None of these build-outs are happening. The shared accountability between security and development. I was at B-Sides conference, and this is a security conference, and one of the leaders of OWASP got up and he said, we're going to hold the developers accountable. Now, as a developer, how does that make you feel? It's very aggressive, right? Doesn't make me feel like I'm in a partnership here. We need to turn the tables around. So I was able to speak after him. So when I got up, I looked at him and said, look, it's an interesting sentiment, but not really what we want. What we want is our development teams to say, I am accountable. So we heard this in the keynote today. We heard it yesterday. This idea that you write it, you run it. This idea that if it's broken, it's your responsibility to go and fix it. These are the things that we need to internalize for the things that are important to our company. All right, master application list. Now this is one that companies struggle with, and there's a lot of ways to go and build this. So is there anyone in security in the audience? Excellent. All right, so we can certainly go look at our artifact repositories, look at our metadata around, and collect metadata around the team, who the owners are. Is this thing still under active development? There's a lot of information you want to know about. What methodologies do they use? What's their mean time to change? So if you think about, and I saw MTTR show up yesterday, but really as a DevOps community, for me it's all about mean time to change. If I have a change in my hand, whether it's something that's a new feature or a bug fix or a security fix, from the time that I check that in, how long does it take before it gets to production? What's the tail? How long does it take you to qualify it and approve it for release to production? Because those things have ramifications as far as risk, as far as downtime. So if you are in an incident and production goes down and I have to make a code change, how long do I do that with low risk? Because I assume that our pipelines account for the risk of it works and it's not going to break other stuff. So how long is that window going to be open? So if I see a vulnerability that's of high severity and has something that can go and attack it today, if I could get the code changed today, how long will it take? Because I need to factor that into my risk. Because if I'm going to be vulnerable for 5 minutes, I'll probably take that risk. If I'm going to be vulnerable for 2 months, because that's how long it takes you to release software, that's a big problem. So this is one that I don't hear a lot of people talking about. Open source and the drift away from where you took it in, again, I say we integrate and abandon, the drift away from that is technical debt that we don't pay attention to. Now this isn't a problem if no vulnerabilities are found. Now when we ship these libraries, hopefully we know that there are no known vulnerabilities against them, but at some time in the future, we may find some. So now what? So how far should we allow our teams to drift? As an engineering organization, if we manage our technical debt, how far should we let our team move away from current? Because if you go from Angular 1 to Angular 2, or I'm going from JBoss 5 to JBoss 7, what kind of things am I going to have to do to move between those versions? Some of those require rewrites. If you move from, say, JBoss 4 to JBoss 7, there's repackaging, which means retesting. There's a new way to pass your identity between Tomcat and JBoss. So you have to think about those things. If I paid that price over time, as those versions came out, there are small changes that need to be made. Now, if I got to go and make all of that and jump there in one swoop, there's a huge cost, there's a huge risk, and sometimes I can't even pay that cost. That cost may be measured in person years. And do I have enough automation to even be able to go back and say the application's still going to work when we get there? So think about paying down this technical debt over time. When we talk about open source, and the title of the talk is not a free lunch, because it's not like a free lunch, it's like a free puppy. There are responsibilities that you take on when you say, I am going to bring this puppy into my life. You got to feed it, you got to walk it, you got to clean up after it. So think about your open source that way. It's not something where you can just sit down and there's no cost associated with it. It gives you a lot of value, but it also gives you some responsibility. Spoke about this briefly yesterday. Security champions are a way, and probably the best way, to get after this problem. So in this world, the security team would uptrain people on every single application development team. So when I'm a manager, when I was an engineering manager, I hate bus factors of 1. I need to have at least 2. So you want to think the same way for this. If I have someone leave the company or move to a different team, do I have someone else going to take over that responsibility? Is there some kind of shared effort going on here? Now, once we train those people, one of the responsibilities with regard to open source that we want to have is they need to maintain the list of libraries that we have. Now, there are tools that can do this automatically. You can integrate them into your pipeline. They will spit out that information. They will also tell you what known vulnerabilities are inside of your libraries, which is really important information. Now, at companies that I talk to, they usually cover 15 to 25% of their entire application portfolio with application security. And this isn't because they don't want to, it's just the time and effort that they're taking and the way that they're doing things is broken. That's as far as they can get. And that other 3/4, they don't know anything about. And what I said yesterday is absolutely true. You become a target of opportunity. You are not usually targeted. If you are targeted, you're probably screwed, right? If we have a nation state like Russia trying to get into your company's data, they'll find a way in through social engineering or through some engineering defects that you might have in your product. But we want to take the risk out of us becoming that target of opportunity, because in a lot of ways, these just require spraying the internet IP range with some well-formed HTTP requests. The thing that happened in Struts was a deserialization vulnerability. So, you take an object, you serialize it, you bring it over the wire, you deserialize it, and there might be some runnable code in there which just gets run. I'd say, okay, here's my object, I'm going to figure out what to do with it. Extremely dangerous, which leads to remote code execution, which gets them into your network. Now, once you get popped, it probably responds back and says, hey, found somebody. And then they look at the list. It's like Joe's Barbershop, don't care. Equifax, ooh, now that's interesting. Let's go poke into that a little bit more. So don't become a target of opportunity. Now, what happens when they maintain these libraries and now we have an incident? So a CVE is announced. So these are done publicly. There's an RSS feed for them. There are other ways to subscribe to these notifications. I figure out whether I am susceptible. So I have this list. I can search it and say, yes, I use this version and I am now susceptible to this. I can figure out which security team, which security champions I need to go talk to, and I'm going to roll up and start up a product security incident response team. Hey guys, you guys are susceptible to this. I need a plan. How long is it going to take you to go fix this? And I need to have constant progress until we're done. I need you to report back to me that we're finished. So it's a force multiplier inside of your company. And it makes our application teams a lot more self-reliant. We want to discover these things early, so we should be looking at how we incorporate open source and third-party libraries into our source code. And as part of that, we want to monitor after production. Because those CVEs get announced later, we don't do a good job of securing those libraries in the same way that we don't do a good job of securing our own source code. And some of these things that can't be found through regular tools. So these kind of deserialization vulnerabilities, that's not something you would typically find with a static analyzer or a dynamic analyzer. It's something that people figure out, and then they use that against us. And it could be even white hats. White hats find these things. They go to these companies. They say, hey, you are vulnerable to this kind of an attack. And they hold off their release until a fix is ready. So those kind of get announced at the same time. Here's a new vulnerability. Here's the fix. So you need to be aware of that and conscious of it. right? So we're looking at this from the time they start coding, from the time we start coding. If I bring in a new library, do I understand its pedigree? Do I understand the vulnerabilities associated with it? And then we monitor that. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this earlier. Mean time to repair, mean time to change. You have to understand that. And you have to be able to track that and understand what it's going to take to release a patch to your software if you find one of these vulnerabilities. And this is something that's generally useful. As an engineering manager, I would want to know this. Now, what if you're a vendor? Does anyone write software that other people buy and incorporate into their applications? So it gets really hairy now. Because open source can say, hey, we're just going to patch the latest version, and you have to move to that. It's free. What do you want? If it's something you're buying, and this is something you should look at your vendors for, because if you see a vulnerability inside of theirs, how long is it going to take them to repair it? Are you on a version that they still support? Will they patch that version? Because if we integrate and abandon, and then they say we don't support that anymore, and a vulnerability gets found, and they say, yeah, it's patched in the newest stuff, the stuff that's supported today. What's it going to take you to move? Again, this is all about technical debt. But if you're one of these vendors, it's like, how many versions do you have to patch? How are you going to even talk to your customers about it and tell them about this vulnerability to make sure that they get patched before they get breached? Incident response plan. So at Veracode, because we're a security company, we do two things when we see a new CVE. We first take a look to see if our software is vulnerable. So we do all that product security incident response stuff. And then we also look to see if our customers are vulnerable. And we would reach out to them if it's something that's severe and has an exploit, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of things that we go through. We use our security champions for that. And make sure that our customers are aware as soon as possible that these things occur. These are things that you can actually, has anyone done a tabletop exercise? Okay, so the theory with tabletop exercises, and we do this at our company, not just from a security point of view, but from a engineering practices point of view. So we would sit down in a room, and maybe one time, in fact, one time we did, production is a smoking hole in the ground. There was a huge explosion, and our colo is gone. Go. So it's an opportunity for you to go around the table from multiple disciplines and say, what would it take to go build a new instance of our production environment? How long are we going to be down for? What things don't we have? Do we have call lists to go even get to the people that we need to get to? Do we have some other location already looked at that we could move to? Do we have backups that will actually restore? Because backup's the easy part, right? That was one of my first jobs at a backup company. The key to it is restoring. Have you ever tried that? So these tabletop exercises give you the ability in a very safe environment to figure out where the holes are, decide if there's work to be done, and then go do that work. So we do the same thing with our open source, and we have these kind of tabletop exercises to go off and try out and say, if this happened, could we handle it, and how fast could we do it? Are there other things that we should be putting in place? All right, so in conclusion, you are currently shipping insecure code. The fact that no one could raise their hand to tell me that they knew the bill of materials for the components that they ship today means that likely you fall into those categories of using insecure components. First thing to do is go out and look for it and find that bill of materials. Compare that to the current list of known vulnerabilities and known vulnerable components. Don't be a target of opportunity, because these breaches will happen, and they don't need to know anything about your application to do it. If you think about anyone in the medical field, so Hollywood Presbyterian in California was breached through open source, and they put malware on there that would basically lock them out of their systems. For almost a week, they had to send patients to other hospitals. They couldn't run their MRI machine. They had none of their patient data because it was all electronic. We allow these things to happen to us. And in fact, if you think about, does everyone remember, I think it was last year or the year before, when the DNS was DDoSed? Do you know how they did that? So the IP camera, who has an IP camera in their house? So most of those have hard-coded passwords in them. They are built with off-the-shelf components that use open source, go figure, that are well known to the attackers. They took your cameras, put new software on them, and used them to DDoS DNS, which means you couldn't get to your bank or wherever else, Amazon or what have you. They took down half the DNS because of that. So we allow these things to happen to ourselves as consumers, and we also do this to our company. So this, I hope, is a wake-up call for you guys to think about what you're using and how you're using it, manage your technical debt, and be ready to act if one of these vulnerabilities gets announced that you're vulnerable to. Thank you. All right, happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
Okay, so from one of the monitoring stuff, not just from security and whatnot, is we're building CRDBs.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to expand our CRDBs to include the breakdown of the components that are being used within the software itself.
Yes.
Assuming that we do that,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of frequency should we be bouncing that up against the vulnerability database? Daily, weekly, what would you suggest?
So great question. Once you get that list, you need to look at that time at the vulnerabilities. As long as you're looking at the feed of new vulnerabilities that are announced, you're fine. So this is a response, not you don't have to go out and look. You should be getting that as incoming traffic and then responding to that as an incident to say, okay, I need to do something now. Because otherwise, you're flooding your team with work that's really not necessary. So as you onboard new applications, it's a new time to go off and look. Hey, here's what we have. You may want to look at compacting down to certain versions and making sure, like I said, have something in your engineering policies around how far can you drift, et cetera, and managing that as well. So what you might want to do is go look at how far they are away from current, because that's going to give you some indication of how long it's going to take to fix something. Anybody else? Yes. You can do it. Yeah. Yeah, no. Unfortunately, no. There are some high performers that do put in, so when these things come out, they have what's called a CVSS score. This is kind of the severity rating of it. So you can put things in your policy to say, hey, CVSS score, it's rated from 1 to 10. Anything greater than 6, I'm going to stop. And again, the problem is, it's not when I ship, it's after I ship. So you integrate it, and now there's a problem. So hopefully you're at the point where you're shipping known, not bad components. Again, I didn't say known good, because we just don't know that there's anything in there. But after shipment, now what do you do? Now let's take the world where you have an application that maybe isn't under active development, and you're using a container. So I've got a Docker container that has third-party or open source software in it, and I've shipped that, and now there's a vulnerability. So what's my patch management look like for that? Now what I need to do is actually redeploy the application without changing the application. Right? I got to update the container, redeploy the application into it, and then redeploy that into my infrastructure. So this is something that we as developers, as we take on more of the decisions of how we ship software, we also have to take on more of the responsibility. So patching kind of becomes our responsibility in this way. Other questions? Anyone's mind changed about open source? Yes, sir.
I guess another thing. Would you recommend, or maybe you won't recommend, would you have some other way to know what's used in your infrastructure and then alert people that needs to be fixed, and or put it in your build pipeline, like Spring, Web, whatever has a vulnerability now, so I hit commit in my pipeline and stops me from getting that record of production.
Right.
Maybe because it's a 7, not a 9.
Right.
9 means I'm obviously easily hacked, maybe, right? But 7, just above our policies, not development.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, are people doing one or the other? What way would you?
So I would suggest that you start with the responsive one. So build that bill of materials and have a response plan, do tabletop exercises, train security champions. I mean, there's a whole lot of work in here to get to the point where you can have a credible risk management program around open source. And by the way, the nice thing about up-training those security champions is now you have more security spread out farther in your company and more knowledge, so those teams can actually do things on their own, which will increase the security of your first-party code, hopefully. Anyone else? Yes. Yes. All right, so here's where I'll be vendor. So this is Veracode vendor. We have a product that does that. We compete with Black Duck. We just acquired a company called White Source? No, Secure Source? It was just this week. We acquired another company. So we already had a capability there. We've included that now into our portfolio, so we have a better capability around that. But you know, it's whatever works for you. My job coming out and speaking is to help you see what's out there and take action. Now, if you choose to build it on Black Duck, or as long as you do something, because I was breached by Equifax. My data is out there. I really wish that had been prevented. I would have liked it to be prevented with my software, but I would have liked to be prevented, period. So, yes, I have opinions, but they're kind of slanted. Anyone else? All right, thank you very much for your time, guys.